Thanks for coming back for another episode of What I Think the Bible Means. In this show, I talk about what I think the Bible means. And the specific focus of that is on things that I believe help me in everyday life. Stuff that crosses over. It's not just enough to read it and to understand it. I want to take something from it that means something today. So thank you for enjoying this exploration with me. And I'm going to introduce today's topic, which is the Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel, Babel, I've heard it any different way. If people fight over how it's pronounced, then they're falling victim to what the Tower of Babel really means, if you ask me. And so I'll be going over that today, what the Tower of Babel means, and how it's just everywhere, if you look at it from a certain angle. So here you go. I'll start with the words of the text. Genesis chapter 11. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Let us build a city with a tower that reaches the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. And the Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language, they had begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That's why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So that's not a very long story, and I've actually listened to a Jordan Peterson lecture on the Tower of Babel, and he doesn't spend very much time on it, and I kind of think I want to take the conversation in the direction he didn't take it, because to me it's more useful. So the Tower of Babel, right? We got to remember that as I do my analysis here, one of the core things that it hinges on is the belief that God, at his core, is a love of all things that are living at the most exact level. So that's what the tree of life represents from my vision of this, because that's what the commandments represent when you listen to Jesus' summary of them in the New Testament. To the two commandments, Jesus says it sums up everything. Love God with all your heart, soul, and strength. That's one. And the second one is love your neighbor as yourself. And I think that he's really saying the same thing two different ways, speaking to two different sets of people, because not everyone's going to understand the message the same way. So he's giving it in multiple languages, right? He has to translate it two different ways. So love your neighbor as yourself, that's the very feelings-based version of God's law, right? Like, you do good for other people because that's how you'd want to be treated, and that's your perspective. Okay, well, that's pretty good, and you can stay out of a lot of trouble by following that advice, and people know that. So that's why we don't go around causing trouble for people, because people who do that are criminals, and eventually it never ends well. Who wants to live the life of a criminal? Even if they're doing it all right, you're on the run, you're against people, you have to hurt people to get by. It's easier in the long run, if you can keep it up, to just be good to people. Just for selfish reasons, it's the right choice. But let's forget about that one. Let's talk about the other one. Love the Lord God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. Well, that one speaks to a different audience. The first one is the feeling of good intentions, right? The second audience is the logical. And believe me, this is how this works. So for this to be a logical argument, the assumption I'm making is the person making this argument has chosen, for reasons which may or may not be logical, to be a follower of this religion, right? And they say it's faith. They say that. They're logical people, but they understand they need faith to believe religion. So I'm talking about that person. So that person believes certain things to be true, because if you don't believe those certain things to be true, you don't get to be a part of the faith. Like it's what the faith believes. So they would say that to love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, that is a list of physical things that you can really break down. Because to love man is hard, because man is always changing. You can't love everybody the same way with the same actions, because what one person sees as love, another might see as oppression. And both of them would be right, because the person who needed your act sees the love behind it, and they understand the cost of what goes with it. And the other person would see a loss of freedom, and both of them would be true. But just because they're both right from their own perspectives, that doesn't mean everybody knows how everybody's right all the time. So that's kind of how I'm getting to, this is the two languages of God's law right here. The one language is you got to do what's right because you know what feels right and what makes you feel like crap, especially when it comes to interacting with other people. And I don't mean on the surface level. Like, you might yell at somebody and for a minute you feel like you really told them off, right? You had all the right words and you really put them in their place. And then an hour later, you're still in that argument. I really put them in their place. Yeah, how dare they say that? And then maybe a day later, you're still going back to it. So, yeah, it might be like a mildly negative place to be in, but that's only because it's getting spread out over so much time. It doesn't avoid it. It just kind of shifts it around. But then the other language, the language of devotion. I need to give this sacrifice. I need to make this set of things. To love God means to follow all of his commands. And that means everything that he wrote down that was good advice. And I shouldn't covet my neighbor's wife. And I shouldn't murder. And I shouldn't commit adultery. And I shouldn't, and I shouldn't, and I shouldn't, and I shouldn't. And he builds this whole network, which at the core of it, like if you get all the way to the outside of what it means to follow these commandments, and what it means to live by the sermon of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, and many of his other sermons and teachings, you get to the same point. So it's either you get to just jump there without understanding it, which is great because there's something there. You treat people well, your life goes well. Or if that's not the way for you, you can approach it from a devotion to God standpoint and say, well, if I do this and this and this, you make a checklist that emulates that leap of faith with a series of many smaller leaps of faith you can agree with. So that's how I understand God, is his word is really just telling me, if I look at everybody as though they're my equal, like a divinely created thing, and made in the image of God. I can't say divinely created because I was born. How that happens is a mystery, but I can take from Genesis, if I'm a believer of this religion, that I was made in God's image. And he says it, and I say that with more confidence than anything else in the Bible, because in the Bible, he says it 3 times in a row, 3 different ways, made in God's image. So there's got to be something there. Otherwise, why put it at the beginning where most people are likely to read it? Because not everybody reads all of the book. So you put like the really juicy stuff at the very beginning to try and get as much of your message across as possible. And so it's right there to start. Made in God's image. And so I have to believe that about everybody. Right? And when I think about the world that way and how special I know I am, just because of how special it is to be alive, like, I'm not saying I'm special and other people aren't. What I'm saying is I am deeply aware of how special my existence is, and how even the most trivial things can be looked at from a point of view that makes them wonderful miracles, because it's all about how you think about it. So this, believe it or not, also ties into the Tower of Babel. So now that I've kind of set the stage, let me go into the actual text here of how I see the psychology behind all of this playing out. So the whole world had one language and one common speech. So I look at the Bible, in addition to everything else that it is, as also being a map of consciousness. And I say map because it's not telling you where to go. It's just showing you all the different places where people have been and where any person may find themselves at any given time. So that's the map I see. Common problems, how they work, and ways to get out of them. That's what the Bible is to me, in addition to everything else that it is. And what a beautiful thing that would be, right? If consciousness and free will are gifts of God, and that's what makes us in God's image different from animals, then having that ability would be really empowering. So that's how I try to think about it. So the whole world had one language and one speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain and settled there. They said to each other, let's make bricks. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to heaven so we may make a name for ourselves. So you get everybody who's on the same page, right? You have unlimited cooperation. That's the parallel there. So you look at that and just ask for a minute, what could you do with unlimited cooperation from 7 billion people? If that question's too big, think of what you could do with unlimited cooperation from a person you really care about, say your wife or your girlfriend or your husband or your boyfriend or your son or daughter. What if you could have unlimited cooperation with even one person? How much could you do? Right? It's endless. You could do anything. And by the way, that's where I get my understanding of the phrase, when 2 or 3 come together in my name, there I am with them, right? If God's command, or the closest thing to the will of God that we can understand, because that's what he tells us in the Bible, here's the tree of life, it's a love of all things that are good and alive. If that's the thing that we understand, then we're going to get there no matter what. But here's where the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and sin, right? That's the other part of how I understand consciousness. Every evil that we have and every evil that we commit on ourselves comes from our decisions about what is good and what is evil. And I don't even mean that in terms of it's wrong to decide what good and evil are in specific actions. Because anyone can look at an action in the moment and say that action is good or evil. And we're very good at that. Stomping a puppy, it's very bad, okay? Helping an old person who fell over get up because you're trying to help an old person who fell over get up would be a good thing, if assuming they wanted to help. You're not forcing old people to get up. That's where we're good at the knowledge of good and evil, but where we're very bad at the knowledge of good and evil is when it comes to things that are way more complicated than a single moment, right? You can't take what you know from a single moment and apply it to something that exists over time. And that's what a human being is, right? We're a collection of decisions and actions and circumstances that melds itself together over time. So it's like baking. You don't have just one ingredient, and they're not all added at the same time, and they're not all the same amount. And sometimes there's heat. Sometimes you burn the damn thing and you have to start over. And then it's all different ingredients. And maybe you measure one of them wrong and the cake turns out lumpy. That's kind of how I feel like our minds are when we try to decide a complicated thing is good or evil from a simple piece of information. Like if you voted, here's a great one. I'm going to use it because I know it gets reactions. If you voted for Donald Trump, you're a bad person, and I don't care what you say. That's the Tower of Babel right there. Lines have been drawn unnecessarily. A whole human being Someone made in the image of God has been reduced to a single insignificant speck. That's not where God lives. God doesn't live when people diminish other people to insignificance. Because from God's perspective, each of us individually is insignificant, right? He's God. We're people. And some of us are better than others. So if God's better than all of us, well, you get where that's going. So that can't be his way. Otherwise, why not just wipe all of us from existence, which happens partially in the flood, but even then, not completely. So a house divided against itself can't stand. So let's talk about what it means to decide between the knowledge of good and evil and how it ties to the Tower of Babel. So the people said, we're gonna make this city, and we're all on the same page. And because we're going to do this thing, it's going to reach all the way to heaven. And God says, if as one people, the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not misunderstand each other, or so they will not understand each other. So this here is where my interpretation of the text goes away from the standard interpretation. I view this as the author recognizing and laying down the laws of cause and effect via metaphor. Okay? So on the surface, it's like God says, well, if they all work together, they're not going to listen to me and they can do anything. We can't have that. Like the surface interpretation of that comes across as petty, vengeful, spiteful, punitive. And I don't think that was the mark here. I think making the decision that that's how it happened and that was the right perception feeds into what the Tower of Babel actually means. Like, you can't decide if God's actions were good or evil without making certain inferences about God. It's all lumped together. And with those certain inferences comes a blindness to things that don't support that inference, right? Like, if you assume that God is mean in this, then how do you rationalize that with God's message that we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves when God is being mean? So you might look at that and say it appears mean, but what else could it mean? I'm using the word mean too many times, so I'll say it a different way. God, remember, is the love of life and everything that is good for life and the desire to help it prosper, reach whatever potential it can. And so if you replace that idea with the Lord, which is the Lord's word, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. So God went down to them. Before, this was a separate thing. So God was separated from this. So let's think about that consciously. You have an idea that is fully formed from your perspective. But let's say you missed something you didn't know existed. It wasn't even your fault. But your idea is not stable in reality the way it's stable in your mind. And it won't, work exactly the way you thought it should. Let's say that exists. We've all been there. You don't know that's true. Because if you knew it was true, you would change it. So that's the state of that. Well, then the Lord goes down to them. And this is where I think the Bible really hits the mark when it comes to the psychological advice that it gives. Is when you combine God with something like that, when you combine the love of life and everything that's good for life with a set of ideas that is all the same, and it's all contained, and it's all in one thing, that thing will destabilize. And it's got nothing to do with the action being taken by God, and everything to do with the actions that have been decided upon as a group violate the most fundamental orders of the universe in such a way that it destabilizes itself from the inside. So that's kind of what I see going on there. It's not God going in there and messing up everybody's day. It's a light being shown on that says, when you combine this with a sustainable way of living, it fails. And here is how you know it fails. You scatter, right? What happens when people get in a fight online over something political and nobody's in a mood to change their mind? How does that usually end? That usually ends with the block button, right? Those people get as far away from each other as they can. So let's talk about that. Go deeper, because this is how I really understand it. That's the layer above the literal. So let me take that an additional layer, because the first layer was talking about the relationships between people. Two people, right? Two different people. Well, there's one more relationship that needs to be explored, because it's the relationship that's even more meaningful than that one, and that's your relationship with yourself. And when I look at myself, there's confusion in there, right? All my voices are different sometimes, you know. I might feel like I got to do a certain thing, and I'll have every good intention following through, and you know, maybe it doesn't turn out the way I thought it would, and maybe I felt like I did everything right, but then the next day you got to do it over again because you actually made it worse. I've made things worse before I've made them better, that's for sure. So let's look at that then. Different languages, right? This goes back to the enmity between you and the woman, between making the land toil for anything fertile to be produced. Because in the absence of just a general goodwill for things that are alive, the only thing that produces cooperation is the fear of debt. Selfishness, right? So convincing people to act selflessly through selfish motivations is a failing proposition, but it's better than nothing. So that's the war that goes on inside, where the own language of here is confused. We don't know what we don't know. Our logic and our emotions make us feel miserable because we don't know how to cooperate with each other. I mean, rather than, go into that, it's a lot easier to just get rid of the logic or the emotion, push it down or say it's not true, or, call the person a doo-doo brain because their words made your words, not as good, or maybe they're just being mean. But the minute that the decision becomes to take that into yourself, well, you took it in there, and your mind is a fertile ground. And your imagination can do just about anything. Whose imagination has limits? Can you even imagine the limits of imagination? How would you do that? I don't know, but the point is, what a person can imagine is so much that they are not the one-dimensional creature they might view themselves to be in the moment, right? Like, they might be balancing all kind of things. I want to believe this and I want to believe that, but I know this is wrong, and man, it really tears you up how everybody fights over that, and you find yourself fighting about it too. And in the middle of all that fighting, well, nothing really happens except you're growing all these negative things that stick around, right? They grow, they get life from you, okay? To get life into an idea, it has to come from somewhere, and it's you. Part of your life is behind that. You can't be growing weeds, right? You can't be nurturing the parts of existence that make you look over your shoulder like somebody's out to get you. You know, no way to live. And anyone who tries it has way more reasons about why they need to be angry about what they're angry about than they can list reasons of why they're thankful to be alive. And if there are reasons where it's, thankful to be alive, then those don't need to be the primary focus, but they do need to be included. Because an honest accounting, I think, leaves a lot of people feeling better after it's done than when they started. And the only thing you have to get rid of for that to be possible is the assumption that it's possible to have a life where there's nothing on the negative column. And you got to get rid of the desire to measure your own column against the column of other people. And it's not because you'd be right or wrong. It's just because you're going to give that life and you're going to make it stronger. Your goal is to know why other people are better than you. You could make that your life's work and make a pretty good argument for it by the time you were done. It might even be good enough to convince people that you didn't matter at all. But I don't think that's the way. So here, finally, the Tower of Babel, I'm going to touch on the most furthest out idea, the limits of my understanding about this. And that is mental languages. Okay? And I view different people as having different mental languages. And it's a different way of saying, my eyes and my brain don't tell the same story to me that your eyes and your brain tell the same story to you. And because two of us can't be in the same place at the same time, it's impossible for me to see exactly what you have seen, the way that you see it when something happens. I can't be in your spot. You have a unique point of view. I can be close to your spot. I could be in the same room. I could maybe understand enough about what you saw to fill in the pieces. But I don't get that view. Nobody gets that view. And trying to give other people that view by force, it doesn't work. It sure feels good to try, though. No, you're just not understanding me. No, this is what you have to understand. You have to understand. Well, we say you have to understand, but we don't say why you have to understand. You have to understand because this is the only way we're capable of explaining it. And we're not smart enough to think of all the different ways that one could say the same exact thing. So we're stuck with what we've got. You have to understand it, or what hope is there? There's a fear behind that. And that fear turns into anger pretty darn quick. Well, what do you mean you don't understand? What's wrong with you? Isn't it obvious? I saw it very clearly from where I was standing, where this thing is very clearly able to be seen. But that other person might not have even been in the same room. They might not even speak the same, language. They might not even understand that what you're talking about exists. They have no idea. But they don't understand it. You do. So, hooray. Good enough. Not good enough because you're still alone. If you want to be right, you have to be right correct. You have to be right correctly. And if being right ends with being alone, you're not doing it right. Which is what happens with the Tower of Babel. Everybody's right. They've all got their own mental languages, their own points of view. And because the Lord is missing, well, that's the only way to bridge the gap. You got to care about these people enough to try and understand what they see. The Tower of Babel is the fracture of the human psyche. If God is everything that every human could be, understood to its maximum potential, then we are the pieces of God. And by finding each other, we become more. Or even if you don't think that's finding God, you're still finding things you don't have. Like if a foolish person would say that you don't learn by trying to understand people who think differently than you do. Of course you learn. It goes without saying, right? No one would argue that. It's silly. Even a kid could point it out. So that's where the Tower of Babel comes in. That's what holds a person back. The lack of God, or replace God with, the lack of sincere desire for the world to be a nice place and a better place for everyone to live, in so much as your ability to make that happen can manifest itself in your daily life. You're going to be fractured if that's gone. And even if you find parts of it, not enough to get the whole thing. There's only one way to get the whole picture. So if you want to understand God, if you want to understand the world, if you understand why people fight and why they do what they do, and if you want to understand how to avoid it, then you only need to understand one thing. Recognize that other people have a different perspective because they have to have a different perspective because you're the only person that gets to see what you see when you see it from where you are. And even in one moment, that could be enough to change things radically. When you spread that out over an entire life, people are way too complicated to sum up in a very short time as one interaction and one decision. Now, you could find a few good questions that might block some things off pretty quickly, but it's not enough to take one snapshot. You don't have direction. You don't have anything. And if all you do is take 100 angles of the same snapshot, you're not seeing anything new that gives you perspective. All you're doing is drilling in how well you know the point you already know. Well, of course you know that point. It's your point. How does it connect to these other points? It doesn't do me any good to see what one point is. One point is a zero-dimensional object. It can't even make a straight line. You need A to B if you're going to have that point go anywhere. So how does that point relate? How does it stack up? You test it a little bit. That's what the Tower of Babel is. Thing gets built up. You think it's the greatest thing in the world, get you all the way to heaven. And then you find out it's a dung and brick, half-finished, half-baked idea. Because, well, it should be reaching to the heavens. You can't even get the damn thing finished on your own. So that, to me, is what the Bible means when it comes to the Tower of Babel. What I take from that for myself personally, it's not hard. It's good because I like my ideas very simple because it's easier to keep track of simple ideas. I understand that my way of thinking is different. And it is different every time I speak to a different person. There are commonalities, like things that we share, a common vocabulary through a spoken language. That's nice to have. Pictures that we can get to, that's a great way of anchoring a thing. But beyond that, the way that we use those things, it's so different. So I try to remember that I'm just as different to them as they are to me. And that if I don't trust them, they've probably got no reason to trust me. And if I treat them as an object of suspicion for no other reason than I'm suspicious because I don't know them, well, I'm going to get the result that asks for. They're going to see that. They're going to hear that in the way I talk. The assumptions that I make behind the questions that I have, the assumptions I don't even know are there, are going to be read or misinterpreted, even worse, because when someone is being, careful like that, suspicious or overly cautious or whatever you call it, it's a lack of trust. Lack of trust is not difficult to spot. In fact, it's usually advertised. And when it's advertised with hubris, then it becomes off-putting and confrontational. And when it's advertised with sincerity and vulnerability, well, then it's accepted because everybody understands that, and nobody likes it. So that's my takeaway from the Tower of Babel is I will never be able to connect with another human being where both of us are speaking about the same thing in the same way, unless at my core there is a desire to understand that person's point of view and to make sure they agree with me when I translate what I think they mean into words that they can understand enough to say, yes, I have it, or no, I don't. Every time I do that, it ends well. Sincerity is hard sometimes to do that. I can't say I always get it right. I don't always want to see the other side of things. I want to be right, especially if the guy's being a jerk. Right? Like if they show you no respect, why would you want to treat that person like they matter? I can't make that decision for anybody, and I can't say anyone's right or wrong for missing the mark because, I've not meant to do it and have, and I've meant to do it and haven't, and everything in between. So who's to say that anyone else isn't caught up in that same struggle that I am? So I got to forget about that part. But the part I got to remember is whenever I try to hurt somebody else, it doesn't come without a cost. And whenever I go out of my way to help somebody, it never leaves me feeling unrewarded. I think it's because both times my goals are easy. A goal to hurt somebody is very easy to see if you did it or not. Well, you did it. How does that make you feel? Feel good? Feel bad? Feel good then bad? Kind of both? Something ain't right. The decision's over, right? The action's over. Now you're just deciding how you feel about it and the whole thing. And things that a person feels good about having done or been a part of, they're not the things that stick around for 10 days or 10 years. That's the stuff that needs to be figured out. So if it's not resolved, not right. And maybe, it's not resolved because what is right is hiding behind what you think is impossible, which is what it means to scatter the face of the earth, the Tower of Babel. The two thoughts get so far apart from each other because they have no desire to seek each other because everything is a threat instead of a thing that, has us, that we could do better by cooperating with. That's what makes that clear for me. So the advice is easy. Same advice, a lot of other parts of the Bible. It's a good idea to listen to what people have to say and to care about them as human beings. And to know that you can disagree with someone's perspective without having to take it any further than that. Because neither one of you has it right all the way, unless you're God. right? There's going to be stuff missing from both things. So if it's a measure of right and wrong, well, then it's an easy conversation because now you have something in common. Common ground is a good place to start any relationship. So I hope that was useful. That's how I understand it. It helps me think about it enough that I act like I believe this is true, that we are just all speaking different languages and taking the time to get to know one another from a place of trust and sincerity is a good investment. And it's one that stands the test of the scientific method, right? If the sincerity is there over time, the results will follow. So I'm willing to put this one up to the test. So anyways, thanks for watching what I think the Bible means. This has been the Tower of Babel and our own split consciousness. Come back for another one. See you then.